The Boeing 737 shuddered through turbulence somewhere over the North Atlantic, and most passengers barely noticed. They scrolled phones, sipped drinks, complained about legroom. In row 10, window seat, a woman in a faded janitorial uniform slept with her cheek pressed against the cold plastic, one arm wrapped around a backpack that never left her lap. Her name tag read Rivera in peeling letters. Her hands bore the rough texture of someone who scrubbed floors for minimum wage, nails trimmed to nothing, knuckles slightly scarred. A few rows back, a businessman in first class made a joke to the flight attendant about the help sleeping in coach. She smiled politely and moved on. Nobody paid attention to the woman in row 10. Nobody wondered why she slept so deeply, or why her breathing followed the measured rhythm of someone trained to rest anywhere, anytime. Nobody noticed the faded tan line on her wrist where a watch had lived for years. Nobody saw the way her jaw clenched even in sleep when the aircraft banked hard to avoid weather. The sky outside turned gray, then darker. The captain's voice came through crisp and professional, explaining a slight course adjustment for passenger comfort. Standard procedure. The seatbelt sign illuminated. Then, 17 minutes later, everything changed. The cockpit door opened and the captain emerged, his face carrying the particular shade of white that comes from staring at instrument panels that no longer make sense. He walked down the aisle slowly, deliberately, scanning faces. His first officer followed 3 steps behind. Passengers looked up from devices, sensing something off in the body language, the silence. When the captain reached row 15, he cleared his throat and spoke into the cabin with a voice that tried for calm and landed somewhere near controlled panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your attention. We have a situation. Both our primary and backup navigation systems have failed simultaneously. We're experiencing hydraulic pressure loss in 2 systems. I need to know if there are any military pilots on board this aircraft. Any branch, any era. If you have combat flight experience, I need you to identify yourself now." The cabin went silent except for the drone of engines. Passengers looked at each other, confused, frightened. The businessman in first class sat up straighter, wondering if this was some kind of drill. A teenager pulled out her phone to record. The captain waited, eyes moving across faces, looking for anyone who understood what he was really saying, looking for anyone who had ever brought a crippled bird home on prayer and skill. In row 10, the woman named Rivera opened her eyes. For 3 full seconds she didn't move. Then her hand reached up and pressed the call button. The chimes sounded impossibly loud. The captain turned, saw the janitorial uniform, the exhausted woman with pillow creases on her face. His expression flickered with something between hope and doubt. Rivera unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Her voice came out rough from sleep, but carried the unmistakable cadence of someone who had spoken into a radio while death rode her wing. "Ma'am, you're a pilot." The captain's question hung in the recycled air. Rivera's eyes, now fully open, held the particular 1,000-yard quality of someone who had seen the world from 20,000 feet while people tried to kill her. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a battered wallet, flipped it open to show an ID card so worn the photo was barely visible. Her fingers moved with the efficiency of someone who had performed pre-flight checks in the dark. Lieutenant Colonel Alyssa Rivera, United States Air Force, retired. Thunderbolt, 1,500 combat hours, Iraq and Afghanistan. Her voice carried no pride, no emphasis, just facts delivered like coordinates. The captain's expression transformed. His first officer actually stepped back. Around them, passengers began to murmur. The businessman in first class stopped mid-sip of his scotch. The teenager's phone captured everything. The captain extended his hand and Rivera shook it once firmly. "Colonel, I need your help. Both pilots are experiencing severe vertigo. Something's wrong with our instruments, maybe worse. We're flying on backup systems and losing hydraulics. I've got 237 souls on this aircraft, and I'm not sure I can bring her down safely." Rivera looked past him toward the cockpit, then back at the captain. Her face showed no fear, no hesitation, just the immediate tactical assessment of someone who had made decisions at supersonic speeds, while surface-to-air missiles tracked her exhaust. She glanced down at her uniform, at the mop cart she'd left in the terminal janitor's closet at JFK, at the life she'd built after the Air Force decided a woman with PTSD and 3 deployments was more liability than asset. Then she looked at the faces staring at her from every row, saw the fear, the children, the families. "Get me in that cockpit," she said. "Now." The captain didn't argue. He turned and moved quickly back toward the front of the aircraft, Rivera following 3 steps behind, her movements shifting from the shuffling exhaustion of a woman working double shifts to the precise economy of a combat pilot moving to her bird. Passengers craned their necks. Someone asked what was happening. The flight attendants tried to maintain calm, but their voices carried edges of panic. As Rivera passed row 23, a man in a Marine Corps veteran cap met her eyes. He nodded once. She nodded back. The cockpit door closed behind them with a heavy click. Inside, the first officer sat rigid in his seat, hands gripping the controls with white-knuckle intensity. Sweat ran down his temples. The instrument panels showed a chaos of conflicting data, altitude readings disagreeing with each other by thousands of feet, heading indicators spinning slowly, warnings cascading across screens. Through the windscreen, clouds pressed in like gray wool, visibility near zero. The captain slid into his seat, hands already moving across controls. "Colonel Rivera, this is First Officer Matthews." Matthews, the colonel, flew A-10s in combat. Matthews turned his head slightly, face pale. "Ma'am, with respect, this is a commercial 737, not a military aircraft. The systems are completely different. The handling characteristics." Rivera cut him off, not rudely but with the absolute authority of someone who had flown damaged aircraft home, while hydraulic fluid painted her canopy red. "I've landed a Warthog with 1 engine, no hydraulics, and a tail section held on by hopes and rivets. This bird still has wings and engines. That means it flies. Now tell me what you've got." Her eyes scanned the instruments, absorbing information, filtering the chaos into signal. The captain began running through the situation. Simultaneous navigation failure, suspected electrical fault, hydraulic pressure dropping in 2 systems, possible flight control degradation. They were somewhere over the North Atlantic, roughly 300 miles from the Irish coast, unable to confirm exact position. Weather below was deteriorating. Fuel was adequate but not generous, and both pilots were experiencing symptoms consistent with hypoxia or instrument-induced spatial disorientation, making them question their own senses. Rivera listened, asked 3 precise questions, then reached for the radio. "What's your company frequency?" The captain gave it to her. Rivera keyed the mic, her voice transforming into the clipped, professional tone of military radio communication. Any station. This is American Airlines Flight 227, declaring emergency. We have multiple system failures and require priority handling. Be advised, aircraft control being assumed by military-qualified backup pilot. Request vectors to nearest suitable airport with emergency equipment standing by." The response came back within seconds, an Irish controller's accent carrying across the static. "Flight 227, Shannon Control reads you loud and clear. Squawk 7700. What are your souls on board and fuel remaining?" Rivera glanced at the captain, who held up fingers. "Shannon Control, 237 souls on board, fuel for approximately 2 hours at current consumption. We need heading and distance to Shannon Airport. Confirm weather and runway condition." The controller's voice remained professional but carried an undertone of tension. "Flight 227, be advised Shannon is reporting crosswinds gusting to 40 knots, visibility 1 mile in heavy rain. We can vector you for ILS approach runway 24. Expect vectoring in approximately 20 minutes. Medical and fire equipment will be standing by." Rivera acknowledged, then turned to the captain. "I need you to talk me through your emergency procedures, everything from hydraulic loss to manual landing if it comes to that. Matthews, you keep flying this bird straight and level. Watch your altitude, trust your instruments even when your body says otherwise. Captain, you're my systems operator. I'll handle the approach and landing, but I need your hands on the backup controls." The captain nodded, already pulling out the emergency checklist. Matthews swallowed hard, but his grip on the controls steadied. Outside, the clouds began to break slightly, showing glimpses of dark ocean below. Rivera settled into the jump seat behind them, her body remembering the feeling of a cockpit even though the switches were all different, the displays unfamiliar. But aircraft physics were universal. Lift, drag, thrust, weight, angle of attack, airspeed, the fundamental truths that kept metal in the sky. She had flown the A-10 Thunderbolt, an aircraft designed to absorb punishment and keep flying, to bring pilots home even when half the plane was shot away. The Warthog had taught her that any aircraft could land once if you understood its soul, if you respected what it could do and what it couldn't. This 737 was wounded but not dead. It could still fly. It could still come home. Rivera closed her eyes for 5 seconds, ran through the mental checklist she had performed before every combat mission. Visualize the approach, anticipate the problems, trust the training, stay ahead of the aircraft. When she opened them again, her hands were steady and her mind was clear. Back in the cabin, passengers sat in near silence, the usual chatter replaced by anxious whispers. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with forced calm, collecting trash, checking seatbelts, saying nothing about the woman in the janitorial uniform who had walked into the cockpit and not come out. The businessman in first class finally put down his phone and stared at the seatback in front of him. The Marine veteran in row 23 held his wife's hand and whispered a prayer. The teenager who had recorded everything uploaded it to social media and watched in real time as views climbed into the thousands. Her caption read, "Combat pilot on our plane just took over from the regular pilots. We might crash. Pray for us." In row 10, Rivera's backpack sat abandoned, still buckled into the window seat. Inside it, beneath the spare uniform and the paperback novel and the lunch she'd packed at 4 that morning, lay a folded American flag in a triangular case, a Purple Heart in a velvet box, and a photograph of a little girl with dark eyes and a missing front tooth. The photograph's edges were worn soft from handling. On the back, in careful handwriting, "Love you, Daddy. Come home safe." The cockpit door stayed closed. Inside, Rivera studied the approach plates the captain showed her, memorizing numbers, visualizing the runway environment. Shannon Airport, runway 24, crosswinds, low visibility, hydraulic degradation. She had landed in worse conditions at Bagram with mortars falling and a fire light illuminating her panel. "Shannon Control, Flight 227 ready for vectors," she transmitted. The Irish controller's voice came back crisp and professional. "Flight 227, Shannon Control, turn right heading 090, descend and maintain 14,000 feet. Reduce speed to 250 knots. You're number 1 for the approach. All other traffic is being held clear." Rivera repeated the instructions back word perfect, and the captain began the turn. The aircraft banked gently, responsive despite the hydraulic issues. Matthews's breathing was audible but controlled. They flew into the turn, the ocean below now visible through breaks in the clouds, gray and cold and endless. Rivera watched the instruments, cross-checking altitude against airspeed, feeling the aircraft's responses. The 737 was heavy, sluggish compared to the nimble A-10, but it flew with the same fundamental honesty. Push the nose down, speed increases. Pull back, speed bleeds off. Respect the physics and the aircraft would take care of you. The radio crackled again. "Flight 227, Shannon, say nature of your emergency and pilot qualifications." The Irish controller's tone suggested he was filing reports while talking, covering his own bases, making sure the recording would show he'd asked the right questions. The captain looked at Rivera, who nodded. He keyed the mic. "Shannon, we have experienced simultaneous navigation system failure, partial hydraulic loss in 2 systems, and both primary pilots are experiencing instrument-induced disorientation. We have a retired U.S. Air Force combat pilot assisting with aircraft control. She's A-10 qualified with 1,500 combat hours." There was a pause. When the controller came back, his voice carried a subtle shift in tone. the universal respect military controllers show for combat-proven pilots regardless of nationality. Flight 227, Shannon Control, acknowledged. Be advised we have you on primary radar. We can provide no gyro vectors if required. Emergency equipment is rolling. Winds currently 230 at 35 gusting to 42. Visibility 1 mile in heavy rain. Runway 24 ILS is operational. Advise when ready for approach briefing. Rivera leaned forward. Shannon, Flight 227 ready for approach briefing, send it. The controller began running through the approach details. Frequencies, altitudes, decision height, missed approach procedures. Rivera absorbed it all, committing it to memory the way she had memorized combat emergency procedures, the way she had learned to recite emergency engine-out procedures while instructors screamed at her in training. Information was survival. Preparation was the difference between landing and crashing. The captain worked through the emergency checklists, configuring backup systems, balancing fuel, preparing the aircraft for the worst-case scenario of a manual landing with degraded controls. Matthews flew the heading and altitude, his initial panic now transformed into the focused concentration of someone doing a job that had to be done. Rivera studied the weather radar display, watching the green and yellow cells that indicated rain and turbulence. The storm system stretched across their approach path like a wall. They would have to fly through it, no way around, fuel considerations making deviation impossible. She had flown through worse, through clouds that spawned tornadoes over Kandahar, through sandstorms that turned the world orange and filled every crack in her cockpit with grit, through the dark smoke of burning oil fields. Captain, when we start the approach, I need you on the throttles. I'll handle the stick. Matthews, you watch altitude and airspeed, call them out every 5 seconds once we're inside 5 miles. If I tell you to do something, do it immediately, no hesitation. We'll get one shot at this. If we have to go around with degraded hydraulics, fuel becomes critical. Both pilots acknowledged. The aircraft descended through 14,000 feet, the clouds swallowing them whole, visibility dropping to nothing. Rain began to hammer the windscreen, rivulets streaming horizontally in the slipstream. The airframe shuddered with turbulence. Somewhere behind them in the cabin, a child began to cry. Rivera's hands remained relaxed, her breathing steady. The radio crackled. Flight 227, turn right heading 120, descend to 8,000 feet. She acknowledged, and the turn began. The minutes stretched out, punctuated by radio calls, heading changes, altitude adjustments. They were being vectored onto the final approach course, guided by a controller somewhere in a warm, dry tower who was watching a blip on a screen represent 237 lives. Rivera thought about her daughter, 6 years old, staying with Rivera's mother while Rivera worked the night shift cleaning office buildings in downtown Boston. The job that paid for rent and daycare, and the child support that never came because her ex-husband, also a veteran, couldn't hold down work either. The job that let her be invisible, that asked nothing of who she had been before. Lieutenant Colonel Alyssa Rivera, call sign Ricochet, named for her ability to bounce back from mission after mission, to absorb damage and keep flying. The Air Force had given her the call sign after her 3rd deployment, after she had brought home an A-10, so shot up the maintenance chief had recommended scrapping it. After she had flown close air support missions that saved platoons, companies, an entire forward operating base. After she had earned the Purple Heart when shrapnel from a near miss had torn through her canopy and embedded in her shoulder, and she had still completed the mission, still brought her bird home, still climbed out of the cockpit and walked to the medical tent under her own power. The Air Force had given her medals and commendations, and then, quietly, forced her into retirement when the nightmares started, when the flashbacks made her too much of a risk, too much of a liability, too expensive to fix. 20 years of service ended with a handshake and a pension that barely covered rent. But you never stopped being a pilot. The muscle memory lived in your hands. The training lived in your brain. The call to serve lived in your blood. Flight 227, you're 8 miles from runway 24, turn right heading 150, descend to 4,000 feet, reduce speed to 180 knots. You're cleared for ILS approach runway 24. Rivera acknowledged, her voice carrying the same calm it had carried during emergency calls when the ground lit up with tracer fire. The captain pulled the throttles back. The aircraft slowed, descended, configured for approach. The landing gear came down with a reassuring thunk. Flaps extended in stages. The aircraft transformed from a sleek cruising machine into something slower, heavier, committed. Outside, the rain intensified. The windscreen wipers beat frantically, but provided only momentary glimpses of gray nothing. Turbulence shook the airframe in irregular pulses. The ILS needles came alive, showing their position relative to the invisible electronic path that would guide them to the runway threshold. Rivera watched the needles, watched the altitude, watched the airspeed. Her hands hovered near the controls, ready to take over if Matthews faltered. But the young first officer was holding it together, flying the approach with increasing confidence. The captain managed throttles and made callouts. They worked as a crew, three people who had never flown together now operating as one organism. 5 miles on glide slope on localizer, the captain called out. 180 knots, sync rate 700 feet per minute. Rivera watched the altitude unwind. 4,000 feet, 3,500, 3,000. The clouds were darker here, the turbulence worse. The aircraft bucked and swayed. The hydraulic pressure gauge for System 2 dipped further into the yellow arc. They were committed now. Below them, somewhere in the rain and clouds, Ireland waited with its green fields and stone walls and a runway that would be slick with water and crosswinds. 2 miles on glide slope on localizer 160 knots, the captain called. The ILS needles showed them centered, perfectly on path. Matthews's hands moved continuously on the controls, making tiny corrections, fighting the wind. Rivera leaned forward, eyes moving between instruments and windscreen. They broke out of the clouds at 800 feet, exactly at minimums, and the world appeared. Rain-lashed fields, a church steeple, lights of vehicles on roads. And ahead, through the diagonal slashes of rain, runway lights marking the path home. The runway appeared narrower than Rivera expected, darker, the crosswind evident in the way rain slanted across it. Emergency vehicles lined the taxiways, red and white lights flashing silently. Foam trucks, ambulances, fire equipment, an airport preparing for disaster. Runway in sight, the captain called. Continue approach. Rivera's hands moved to the controls, taking over from Matthews without a word. Her fingers wrapped around the yoke and she felt the aircraft through it, felt the wind trying to push them off centerline, felt the weight and momentum, felt every response. She had never flown a 737 before this moment, but she had flown aircraft in combat, flown them wounded and heavy and stubborn. She understood the language aircraft spoke. The crosswind hit them from the right, trying to weathervane the nose. Rivera compensated with rudder, kept the wings level with aileron, flew a coordinated sideslip that looked wrong but felt right. The A-10 had been honest in its responses, brutal in its feedback, forgiving in its limits. This Boeing was different but not alien. Altitude 500 feet, airspeed 140 knots, descent rate 600 feet per minute. The runway rushed up, growing wider, white-painted lines emerging from the rain. Rivera made continuous tiny inputs, never fighting the aircraft, working with it, feeling its responses. She had landed at Bagram in a sandstorm with visibility measured in feet. She had landed at remote forward operating bases on dirt strips cratered by mortars. She had landed with battle damage, with warning lights, with fuel calculated to the minute. This was just another landing, 300 feet. The wind tried to push them right. Rivera corrected, kept the nose pointed down the center line. 200 feet. Sync rate steady. The captain's hand hovered over the throttles, ready to go full power for a go-around if she called for it. 100 feet. The runway threshold passed beneath them. 50 feet. Rivera began the flare, pulling back gently on the yoke, letting the aircraft settle, killing the descent rate while maintaining directional control. The mains touched down with a bark of rubber on wet concrete. Rivera deployed the spoilers, called for reverse thrust. The captain pushed the throttle levers up and back, engaging the reversers. The nose dropped and touched, and Rivera stood on the rudder pedals to keep them centered as the crosswind tried one last time to push them off the runway. The aircraft decelerated, hydroplaning briefly then gripping, slowing, bleeding off speed and energy. Rivera steered with rudder and nose-wheel steering, keeping them straight. The emergency vehicles raced alongside, keeping pace. Airspeed dropped through 80 knots, 60, 40. The end of the runway approached. Rivera applied brakes carefully, feeling for the edge of traction. They slowed to taxi speed and turned off onto the taxiway. Only then did Rivera release her grip on the controls. Her hands were shaking slightly. The captain was breathing hard. Matthews had his eyes closed, head tilted back against the headrest. Outside, emergency vehicles surrounded them, but there was no fire, no crash, no disaster. Just an aircraft that had landed, wounded but alive. The radio crackled. Flight 227, Shannon ground, nice work. Taxi to gate Alpha 4, emergency equipment will follow. Welcome to Ireland. Rivera picked up the mic, her voice hoarse now, the adrenaline beginning to fade. Shannon ground, Flight 227, thank you for the assist. Taxi to Alpha 4, emergency equipment can stand down. This bird's on the ground and going nowhere. She set down the mic and closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Behind her, she could hear movement in the cabin, voices, crying, applause beginning hesitantly, then building. Someone cheered. Someone else was praying audibly. The captain turned in his seat and looked at Rivera with an expression that mixed gratitude, respect, and exhaustion. Colonel, I don't have words. You saved 237 lives today. Rivera opened her eyes and met his gaze. I was in the right place at the right time. You two kept this bird flying when everything went to hell. That's what saved everyone. Matthews turned as well, his face still pale but smiling now. Ma'am, that was the most insane piece of flying I've ever seen. That crosswind landing in this weather with degraded hydraulics, on an aircraft you've never flown before, Rivera shook her head. Just another day at the office. Let's get these people off this plane and onto solid ground. The captain began the shutdown procedures, methodical and professional even now. Rivera stood up from the jump seat, her body remembering the exhaustion of post-mission letdown, the way adrenaline debt came due all at once. She had to steady herself against the cockpit door. When she opened it and stepped into the cabin, the applause hit her like a physical force. Every passenger was standing, clapping, crying, cheering. The flight attendants were crying too. The businessman from first class was on his feet, scotch forgotten, clapping harder than anyone. The Marine veteran stood at attention, saluting. Rivera stopped, overwhelmed. She had flown combat missions that saved lives and never got this response. She had brought damaged aircraft home and received only brief acknowledgments. She had bled for her country and gotten a medical retirement. Now, wearing a janitor's uniform with someone else's name tag, she was being cheered like a hero. She raised one hand, gesturing for quiet. It took a minute for the applause to die down. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain and first officer kept this aircraft flying. I just helped bring it home. Please remain seated while the crew completes their procedures. We're safe now. But the passengers didn't sit. They kept clapping. A woman in row 12 reached out and grabbed Rivera's hand. Thank you, she sobbed. I have 3 kids at home. Thank you for bringing me back to them. Rivera squeezed her hand once gently. You're welcome, you're safe now. She made her way back to row 10 slowly, passengers reaching out to touch her arm, her shoulder, thanking her. The teenager with the phone was recording everything, tears streaming down her face. The Marine veteran spoke quietly as she passed. Semper Fi, Colonel, outstanding flying. Rivera nodded to him. Thank you, Marine. She reached row 10 and collapsed into her seat, suddenly so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. Her backpack was still there, still buckled in, waiting. She pulled it onto her lap and hugged it, feeling the hard edges of the flag case and metal box through the fabric. Outside, fire trucks and ambulances surrounded the aircraft, their lights painting the interior in rotating colors. Ground crew approached with stares. The door opened and airport officials climbed aboard, moving quickly to the cockpit, talking in urgent tones. Rivera sat and watched through the window as rain continued to fall. The flight attendants began organizing deplaning procedures. The passengers were reluctant to leave, many still crying, many still trying to process what had happened. The businessman from first class made his way back to row 10 and stood in the aisle. "Ma'am, I want to apologize. Earlier I made a comment about you, about your uniform. I'm sorry, I was wrong." Rivera looked up at him, saw the genuine contrition. "It's okay, you didn't know." "No, it's not okay. I judged you based on what you looked like, not who you were. That's on me." He extended his hand. "Thank you for saving my life." Rivera shook his hand once. "You're welcome." He turned to leave, then stopped. "What's your name, your real name?" "Alyssa Rivera." "Thank you, Colonel Rivera. I'll never forget this." He walked away. Rivera closed her eyes again, listening to the sounds of deplaning, of passengers gathering their belongings, of normal procedures resuming after extraordinary circumstances. She thought about her daughter waiting in Boston, about the shift she was supposed to work tonight cleaning bathrooms in the financial district, about the life she had built after the Air Force had finished with her. She thought about the cockpit, about the feeling of flying again, about the way her hands had remembered even when her mind had tried to forget. An airport official appeared at her row, accompanied by a man in a suit who had "airline executive" written all over him. "Colonel Rivera, I'm Daniel Walsh, station manager for Shannon Airport. This is Marcus Chen, senior operations director for American Airlines. We need to debrief you and there are some media requests. Can you come with us?" Rivera stood slowly, shouldering her backpack. "Can we make this quick? I have a daughter I need to call." Walsh smiled. "Of course. And Colonel, on behalf of everyone at Shannon Airport, thank you. That was extraordinary flying." They led her off the aircraft, down the stairs into the rain. She paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked back up at the 737, battered but intact, having survived another day. Like her. The terminal was chaos. Media crews had already arrived, cameras and reporters and lights. The passengers from Flight 227 were being shepherded through security procedures, many still emotional, all talking at once. Rivera was escorted to a private room where officials from the Irish Aviation Authority waited with clipboards and laptops. The debriefing took an hour. They asked about the approach, the landing, the hydraulic systems, the decision-making process. Rivera answered every question with military precision, sticking to facts, avoiding drama. They recorded everything. When they finished, Walsh stood and offered his hand again. "Colonel, you'll be pleased to know that preliminary examination shows the aircraft had a major electrical fault that cascaded into multiple system failures. You landed an aircraft that by rights should have crashed. The manufacturer will want to speak with you, so will accident investigators." Rivera nodded tiredly. "I just want to call my daughter." "Of course. There's a phone you can use in the next room. Take your time." She made the call standing by a window that looked out onto the tarmac, watching the 737 being towed away for inspection. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Mom, it's me. I'm okay. Something happened with the flight, but everyone's fine. Can I talk to Sophia?" There was a pause, then her mother's voice, tight with concern. "Alyssa, what happened? I saw something on the news, a plane making an emergency landing in Ireland. Mom, I'm fine. Really, can I just talk to Sophia?" Another pause, then the sound of the phone being passed and her daughter's voice, small and sweet. "Mommy," Rivera felt tears well up for the first time since the emergency began. "Hey baby, Mommy's okay. I'm in Ireland, but I'll be home soon. Are you being good for Grandma?" "Yes, Mommy." "Grandma said you were on a plane that had trouble." "The plane had some problems, but everything's okay now. I helped the pilots land safely." "Are you a pilot, Mommy? I thought you cleaned buildings." Rivera closed her eyes. "I used to be a pilot, baby, a long time ago, before you were born." "Did you fly jets?" "Yes, sweetie, I flew jets in the Air Force." "That's cool. Can you tell me about it when you get home?" "Yes, baby, I'll tell you about it. Now you go back to playing. Mommy loves you so much." "Love you too, Mommy. Come home soon." The call ended and Rivera stood there holding the phone, looking out at the rain. Behind her, the door opened and Walsh appeared. "Colonel, there are quite a few media requests. CNN, BBC, Sky News, and about a dozen others. They want to interview you. The airline would like you to do at least one statement. And there's someone from the U.S. Embassy here who wants to speak with you." Rivera turned from the window. "I'll do one statement. Then I need to get to Boston. I have a daughter waiting." Walsh nodded. The airline is arranging transportation. They're putting you on the next flight to Boston first class, no charge. They're also discussing compensation for your assistance. I don't want compensation, I just want to get home. I understand, but the airline will insist. You saved them from a catastrophic loss, not just the passengers, but the aircraft, the liability, the reputation damage. They'll want to make this right, Rivera sighed. Fine, but first, the statement. They set up in a conference room with a single camera and a few reporters. Rivera sat at a table, still wearing her janitor's uniform, her hair still disheveled from sleeping on the plane. Walsh introduced her and the questions began. Colonel Rivera, can you walk us through what happened? She described it factually, clinically, keeping emotion out of it. The emergency, the approach, the landing. She gave credit to the captain and first officer. She downplayed her own role. Colonel, you haven't flown a 737 before. How did you know what to do? Aircraft physics are universal. The training I received in the Air Force prepared me for emergency situations. The captain and first officer did excellent work under extreme stress. You're working as a janitor now. How does a decorated combat pilot end up cleaning buildings? The question hung in the air. Rivera looked directly at the camera. I served my country for 20 years. When I left the Air Force, I had to find work that would support my daughter. There's no shame in honest work, whatever form it takes. But don't you feel that your skills were being wasted? My skills were available when they were needed. That's what matters. More questions followed. She answered them patiently, professionally, giving them nothing sensational, no drama, just facts. When it ended, Walsh escorted her out through a side door to avoid the growing media presence. A car waited to take her to a hotel where she could shower and change before her flight. In the hotel room, Rivera finally allowed herself to break down. She sat on the edge of the bed and cried, not from fear or stress, but from something she couldn't quite name. Relief. Exhaustion. The sudden crack in the armor she had built to survive after the Air Force. The feeling of being useful again, of being who she had been before the nightmares and the medical boards and the involuntary retirement. She cried for 10 minutes, then showered, put on the spare uniform from her backpack, and headed back to the airport. The flight to Boston left 4 hours later. The airline had indeed upgraded her to first class. The businessman from the original flight was on the same connection, and when he saw her boarding, he stood up and started clapping. Then everyone in first class joined him. Rivera smiled tiredly and took her seat. The flight attendant brought her champagne she didn't drink and told her she was a hero. Rivera closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the approach, the landing, the feeling of the controls in her hands. She kept thinking about the cockpit, about the radio calls, about the satisfaction of bringing a crippled bird home. The thing she had tried to forget for 3 years came roaring back. She was a pilot. She would always be a pilot. The plane touched down at Logan Airport 6 hours later. Rivera deplaned to find airport officials waiting, more media, and representatives from American Airlines corporate. They escorted her to a VIP lounge where the airline's CEO waited via video conference. He thanked her profusely, announced that the airline was offering her a job as a pilot instructor, and said that her actions had saved the company from a catastrophic loss. Rivera listened politely and said she would think about it. She just wanted to go home. They let her leave through a service exit. A taxi took her to her mother's house in Dorchester, a triple-decker in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. She climbed the stairs slowly, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Her mother opened the door before Rivera could knock. Sophia stood behind her, still in pajamas even though it was evening. "Mommy!" Sophia ran forward and Rivera caught her, lifting her up, holding her close. "Hey baby, Mommy's home." Her mother hugged them both. "I saw the news. Alyssa, what you did, Mom, I just want to go inside and sit down." They went inside. Rivera collapsed on the couch, Sophia curled against her side. Her mother made coffee and sat in the armchair, watching her daughter with an expression of pride and concern. "The news is calling you a hero. They found your service record. They're talking about your deployments, your medals." Rivera closed her eyes. "I just did what needed to be done." The Air Force called. "They want you to call them back. Something about reviewing your case." Rivera opened her eyes. "What case?" Your retirement. They're saying maybe it was premature. They want to talk about reinstatement. Rivera sat up, carefully moving Sophia to the side. They forced me out. They said I was too damaged, too much of a liability. That was 3 years ago. Things change. Maybe they made a mistake. Rivera stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street she had grown up on, the neighborhood she had returned to after the Air Force had finished with her. She thought about the cockpit, about the feeling of flying, about the satisfaction of bringing people home safe. She thought about Sophia, about the life they had built, about the stability of a paycheck even if it came from cleaning toilets. She thought about who she was and who she wanted to be. Her phone rang. The number had a Virginia area code. Pentagon, she answered. This is Rivera. Colonel Rivera, this is General Patricia Morrison, Air Force Personnel Center. I'm calling about your retirement status. Ma'am, I've reviewed your file and the circumstances of your medical separation. I'd like to discuss the possibility of bringing you back to active duty. Rivera leaned against the window, phone pressed to her ear. General, with respect, the Air Force made its position clear 3 years ago. I was damaged goods. Colonel, the Air Force made a mistake. We lost a good officer because we didn't properly support you through your recovery. I'm not going to make excuses. But I am authorized to offer you reinstatement at your former rank with full back pay and benefits. We need pilots like you. Rivera looked at Sophia, who was watching her with wide eyes. General, I have a daughter. I'm a single parent. Active duty means deployments, moves, instability. We can work around that. There are positions at training bases, instructor roles, staff positions. Your choice of assignment within reason. And Colonel, what you did today demonstrates that you're not just fit for duty, you're exceptional. The Air Force needs exceptional. Rivera was silent for a long moment. I need time to think about it. Understood, I'll send the formal offer in writing. Take your time. But Colonel, please consider it. You belong in the cockpit, not in a janitor's closet. The call ended. Rivera set down the phone and turned to her mother and daughter. What was that about? Her mother asked. The Air Force wants me back. Sophia's eyes went wide. You're going back to being a pilot. Rivera crossed the room and knelt in front of her daughter. Baby, I don't know yet. It would mean big changes for us. I'd be gone sometimes. We might have to move. But it would also mean Mommy could do what she's good at, what she was trained for. Sophia thought about it with the seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage. Would you be happy? The question struck Rivera like a physical blow. Would she be happy? Yes, baby, I think I would. Then you should do it. Grandma can take care of me when you're gone. Rivera pulled her daughter close, feeling tears threaten again. I love you so much, you know that. No, Mommy, I love you too. Over Sophia's shoulder, Rivera met her mother's eyes. Her mother nodded once, giving permission, giving blessing. The rest of the evening was quiet. Rivera put Sophia to bed, read her 3 stories, and stayed until she fell asleep. Then she went to the kitchen where her mother was washing dishes. You're going to take it, her mother said without looking up. I don't know yet. Yes, you do. You've known since the second that plane took off. You just needed permission to want it. Rivera leaned against the counter. I tried so hard to put it behind me. The flying, the deployments, all of it. I tried to be someone else. And you were miserable. Alyssa, I watched you come home from the Air Force broken and lost. I watched you build a life cleaning buildings and raising your daughter. You did what you had to do and I'm proud of you for it. But I also watched the light go out in your eyes. Today, on the phone when you called from Ireland, I heard it come back. That's worth something. Rivera nodded slowly. It would mean big changes. Change isn't always bad. Sophia is strong, she'll adapt. And she'll be proud of her mother, the pilot, not her mother, the janitor who used to be a pilot. There's no shame in being a janitor. No, there isn't. But there's no honor in hiding who you are either. Rivera thought about the cockpit, about the controls under her hands, about the satisfaction of bringing 237 people home alive. She thought about the A-10, about close air support missions, about radio calls from ground forces screaming for help. She thought about call sign Ricochet, about the pilot she had been before the PTSD diagnosis, before the nightmares made her wake up screaming, before the Air Force decided she was too expensive to fix. And she thought about Sophia, about raising her daughter alone, about being the example she wanted to set. I'll call them tomorrow, Rivera said. Her mother smiled. Good. That night, Rivera slept without nightmares for the first time in years. The next morning, she called General Morrison and accepted the reinstatement offer. The paperwork took 2 weeks. During that time, her story went viral. The video the teenager had recorded on the plane had been viewed 30 million times. News outlets around the world covered it. Combat pilot working as janitor saves airliner. Hidden hero, decorated veteran returns to cockpit. The woman in row 10. Rivera gave a few more interviews carefully, always deflecting praise to the captain and first officer, always emphasizing that she had just been in the right place at the right time. But the story resonated. It touched something in people, the idea that heroes could be hidden anywhere, that service and sacrifice didn't end when the uniform came off, that skills and training and dedication could lie dormant and then spring back to life when needed. The airline made her offer official. A position as a senior instructor pilot, training pilots in emergency procedures, teaching the next generation how to handle the situations that killed people when they went wrong. Rivera accepted, contingent on her Air Force reinstatement allowing it. The Air Force approved it as a reserve status arrangement. 2 months after the emergency landing, Lieutenant Colonel Alyssa Rivera reported back to active duty at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada. Sophia started first grade at a school near the base. Rivera's mother moved with them, selling the house in Dorchester, leaving Boston for the desert. Rivera went through requalification training, demonstrating that she could still fly, still handle emergencies, still meet the standards. She exceeded every requirement. They offered her an A-10 again. She turned it down, opting instead for a training position that would keep her stateside, close to Sophia, but she flew. She flew training missions, flew check rides, flew proficiency flights. And every time she climbed into the cockpit, every time her hands wrapped around the stick, every time the engine noise surrounded her, she felt complete. The Air Force made her the face of a recruiting campaign. Your service matters. Billboards and television ads showing her in uniform, telling her story, encouraging veterans who had left the service to consider returning. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of veterans reached out, asking about reinstatement, about second chances, about coming back to the work they had trained for. Rivera's case became a template. The Air Force established a formal program for reviewing medical retirements, for bringing back experienced personnel who had been separated during the post-war drawdown. Personnel officers looked at PTSD diagnoses with more nuance, with more willingness to provide support rather than separation. 6 months after Shannon Airport, Rivera was promoted to full colonel and given command of a training wing. She stood in front of a formation of new pilots and told them about standards, about excellence, about never giving up on themselves or each other. She told them about an emergency landing in Ireland and the lessons learned. She told them that their training might save lives in ways they couldn't predict. A year later, Sophia turned 7. Rivera threw her a birthday party on base, inviting her daughter's new friends, the children of other military families. They ate cake and played games and celebrated. That evening, after the guests left, Sophia asked to see her mother's medals. Rivera got out the box she kept in her closet. The Purple Heart, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal with Valor device, the campaign ribbons from Iraq and Afghanistan. She laid them out on the bed and explained each one. Sophia touched them carefully, reverence in her small fingers. Were you scared, Mommy, when you got these? Sometimes, baby, but being scared doesn't mean you don't do your job. It means you do your job even though you're scared. I want to be like you when I grow up. Rivera pulled her daughter close. You can be anything you want to be. Pilot, doctor, teacher, whatever makes you happy. The important thing is that you use your skills to help people, that you show up when you're needed. Like you did on the plane. Like I did on the plane. 2 years after Shannon, the captain and first officer from Flight 227 invited Rivera to their airline's annual safety conference. She gave a keynote speech about emergency decision-making, about crew resource management, about the importance of accepting help from unexpected sources. The captain presented her with a model of the 737 they had landed, mounted on a plaque that read, "To Colonel Alyssa Rivera, who taught us that heroes come in many forms." Rivera kept it on her desk. 5 years after Shannon, the A-10 community held a reunion at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Rivera attended, wearing her uniform, her rank insignia bright and sharp. She saw pilots she had flown with, maintainers who had kept her aircraft flying, commanders who had sent her into harm's way. They remembered her as Ricochet, the pilot who always came back, who always brought her wingman home. An old sergeant approached her, gray now but still straight-backed. "No, I was your crew chief during your second deployment. Heard what you did on that airliner. Just wanted to say I wasn't surprised. You always knew how to fly the unflyable." Rivera shook his hand. "I had a good crew chief keeping my bird in the air. Still got that hog I crewed for you. She's in the boneyard now, but I go visit her sometimes. Tail number 566. You remember her?" Rivera smiled. "I remember. She took a beating and kept flying. Like her pilot." They talked for an hour, swapping stories, remembering deployments, honoring the dead, celebrating the living. When the reunion ended, Rivera walked out to the boneyard, the aircraft graveyard where retired planes waited in the desert sun. She found tail number 566, her old A-10, sitting among hundreds of others. The paint was faded, the tires were flat, the canopy was dusty. But she was still recognizable, still defiant, still the warthog that had brought Rivera home. Rivera stood beside the aircraft and placed her hand on the fuselage. She thought about missions flown, about dangers survived, about the person she had been in this cockpit. She thought about the journey from here to Shannon Airport, from combat pilot to janitor to training commander. She thought about redemption and second chances and the way life circled back to what mattered. "Thank you," she whispered to the aircraft. "Thank you for bringing me home." The desert wind blew across the boneyard, carrying dust and heat and memories. Rivera stood there for a long time, hand on the metal skin of the aircraft that had saved her life more than once, the aircraft that had taught her to survive. Then she walked away, back to her life, back to her daughter, back to the work of training the next generation, back to who she was meant to be. 10 years after Shannon Airport, Colonel Alyssa Rivera retired from the Air Force for the second time. This time it was on her terms, with full honors, after a career that had been resurrected and had flourished beyond expectation. The retirement ceremony was held at Nellie's, with her wing formation standing in dress uniform, with generals speaking about her contributions, with her daughter, now 16, watching from the front row. Rivera stood at attention while they read her citations, while they praised her service, while they folded the flag. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it short. "I learned a long time ago that service takes many forms. It can be combat missions over hostile territory. It can be emergency landings in storms. It can be cleaning buildings to support your family. What matters isn't the uniform you wear or the title on your name tag. What matters is that when you're needed, you show up. You do the work. You bring people home. Thank you for letting me serve. Thank you for the second chance. And thank you for remembering that every person you meet might be carrying skills and experiences and stories you can't see on the surface." The formation applauded. Her daughter cried. Rivera walked off the field for the last time, civilian again but different from the last time she had left. This time she left whole. She took a position with the airline, full-time, training pilots in emergency procedures. She bought a house near the airport. Sophia enrolled in college with dreams of becoming an aerospace engineer. Rivera taught classes, flew simulator scenarios, shared her experience with thousands of pilots who would go on to fly millions of passengers. She became known in the industry as the best emergency instructor in the business, the one who could teach pilots not just procedures but mindset, not just skills but confidence. 20 years after Shannon, at age 65, Rivera finally fully retired. She sold the house, bought a small place in Colorado near her daughter who was now married with children of her own. She volunteered at the local airport, mentoring young pilots, especially young women who wanted to fly military aircraft. She told them about the A-10, about combat missions, about the day she landed an airliner in a storm. She told them that setbacks weren't endings, that second chances existed, that their value wasn't determined by other people's assessments. One day, a teenager showed up at the airport asking for her. The girl was 17, nervous, carrying a folder full of research. "Colonel Rivera, my name is Emma Walsh. I'm Daniel Walsh's granddaughter. He was the station manager at Shannon Airport when you landed Flight 227. He passed away last year, but he told me about that day. He said it changed how he thought about people, about judging them by appearances. He made me promise to find you and thank you." Rivera invited the girl to sit. "Your grandfather was a good man. He treated me with kindness when he didn't have to. He talked about you all the time. He said you were proof that heroes hide in plain sight. He said we should never assume we know someone's story just by looking at them." They talked for 2 hours. Rivera showed Emma photographs from her Air Force career, shared stories, answered questions about flying and service and life. When Emma left, she hugged Rivera and whispered, "Thank you," one more time. Rivera stood in the doorway of the airport office and watched the girl walk to her car. She thought about the chain of moments that had led from sleeping in row 10 to standing here decades later, still making a difference, still being remembered. She thought about the businessman who had apologized, about the Marine veteran who had saluted, about the captain and first officer who had trusted her, about the passengers who had applauded, about the daughter who had asked if she'd been scared. She thought about all the lives that intersected with hers because she had been on that particular flight, in that particular seat, awake at that particular moment. She thought about purpose and meaning, and the way one decision could ripple outward forever. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Rivera walked out onto the tarmac where a few small planes were tied down for the night. She ran her hand along the wing of a Cessna, feeling the familiar texture of painted metal, the coolness of evening air. Somewhere above, an airliner crossed the sky, its contrail bright against the darkening blue. Rivera watched it pass, watched it carry its cargo of people and stories and lives to their destinations. She thought about the pilots up there, flying their routes, managing their systems, trusting their training. She thought about passengers sleeping in coach, working in uniforms, carrying backpacks with photographs and flags and histories no one could see. She thought about the hidden competence all around us, the veterans working civilian jobs, the skilled people doing humble work, the stories concealed behind name tags and tired eyes. She thought about the moment the captain had asked if any pilots were on board, about the 3 seconds she had waited before pressing the call button, about the decision to stand up and identify herself. It would have been easy to stay silent, to let someone else handle it, to remain invisible, but she had pressed the button. She had stood up. She had walked into the cockpit and done the work she was trained to do. That choice had changed everything. Rivera smiled and turned back toward the office. Her granddaughter was waiting to pick her up for dinner. Her life was full, her service complete, her story written. But she knew that somewhere right now, someone else was sitting in a uniform that didn't show their skills, sleeping in a seat that hid their history, waiting for the moment when they would be needed. And when that moment came, when someone asked if anyone could help, they would press the button. They would stand up. They would do the work, because that's what you did. You showed up when you were needed. You brought people home. You served. The sky darkened. The lights of the airport came on. Inside the terminal, travelers moved through their journeys, each carrying their own stories, their own skills, their own hidden competence. And somewhere among them, unnoticed and unremarked, the next hero waited.